famous question, what is truth, can be interpreted in two very different ways. It can be taken as asking what is the truth about this or that question and how are we to ascertain it, or it can be taken much more underminingly as asking what does one mean by truth? Is there such a thing? Is there really any difference between truth and error? And I think it's true to say that the world into which C.S. Lewis grew up and in which he lived out his life was one in which the second interpretation was insidiously ousting the first. Moreover, that it was tending more and more to be answered by a few deliberately and consciously, but by an ever-increasing number, only half-consciously, in the negative.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you on a pleasantly overcast day here in Tbilisi, Georgia, which is a place you probably need to look up on a map since it's not in America. Well, yesterday was quite warm, and the day before was the National Independence Day, May 26th, and I went around with some friends and walked through the town. Very crowded. Georgians love big crowds where nothing much is happening, but you can't really move, but there you are. It's a Georgian thing. Everybody kind of likes crowds in different countries. I'm not a big crowd person, but I don't go every year, but once every few years I will go to this just to renew my membership in the country. Well, today what we're going to do is a continuation, in a way, of my last video, which was why we people living today have such difficulty understanding history. And today we will be doing some of my history book recommendations. Now, I have read quite a few history books, and these are the ones that came to me off the top of my head. As you know, my full library is back in Alaska, and I am desperately hoping to bring it here, but unfortunately that's going to require a good chunk of money, and, you just live. That's why I've built up my library here. But, so I have left off quite a few books that were meaningful to me, historically speaking. But what I want to do now is to give you some ideas. Now, these must be good books since they just simply came to my mind. They stuck in my mind as being good books. And I think one of the problems is finding history books that are not simply polemics for one side or another, propagandistically. Now, in a way, you can't avoid that because everyone has a perspective. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the kind of book. I've read them. There are books I've read where, one of the people I'm not going to mention is Michel Foucault, who I've read his book on insanity, and I got the feeling that there was a big drag of postmodern philosophy weighing the book down. It was an interesting book, and I did get something from it, but that's not one of the kinds of books I will be doing here. Nor will I be doing, since I'm a Christian, any kind of cheap Christian hagiographies, the kind of books that just paint a rather one-sided picture of a historical figure to build up the faith. There is a place for that kind of thing, but it's not here. So, before we get too far into this, hey, have you become a subscriber yet? It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. Hit that. Hit the bell icon that's somewhere in, however you're watching that, and that'll help you know when I erratically drop videos. Also, like this thing, help the algorithms, help Burn get to know his personal algorithm. Gosh, AI is becoming a problem. I'm watching these videos, just an aside, I'm watching these videos more and more, and I'm sitting there going like, the more professional, the more I worry. Because it is precisely these very professional, flashy videos, lots of images and such, that are the most prone to being AI. And you can tell now it's getting harder and harder. I can tell because I'm listening to the voice, and instead of saying something normally, they'll be saying something normally. Anyway, that's a whole thing I've got to deal with at some point as far as making a video on. But you can also really support the channel by contributing. There's a PayPal link below, which will give you options, monthly or a one-time shot. There's also a GoFundMe, which is particularly good if you want to help me out seriously and want a tax-deductible receipt. It's got nearly $20,000 on it, but that's from a year and a half and 4 years ago, and I've just kept this thing. So actually, there's nothing on it. It's just numbers. It's just digital images. Anyway, if you want to do that, and if you feel like giving $25 and you want a copy of my strange book of puppet plays, which I indeed did write, feel free to include the word book in your contribution. Okay. History. Where to begin? Well, none of these books is a place to begin. All of them are a place to begin. It really depends on what you're interested in. But let's say you're interested in looking at what is history. Here's a book I would recommend. It's by a man named Oscar Handlin, a scholar who dealt with immigrant issues from the early half of the 20th century. But in 1979, he wrote a book called Truth in History. And in this book, he laments the fact that history was now being divvied up into these special interest groups. So now there was a women's history and a black history, and, certainly there would be a gay history and all of these things, which he said suffer almost directly from what I was just talking about. They are they so want to prove a point that they omit anything that doesn't prove the point. Now, that is this is what he was seeing in 1979. The situation by the present day is far, far worse. So, but I recommend that book. He was an early voice warning against essentially the incursion of political correctness into the study of history. And he says that truth is what history is about, and that we have to seek truth above all, the truth of events. One person who is, shall we call him a friend of the show, Tom Holland is a contemporary historian, and he and Dominic Sandbrook, whom I must confess I've never read any of Dominic's books, have this great podcast, The Rest is History, which I highly recommend. I don't agree with everything they say. For instance, when they did their Beatles episode, they did not mention Bob Dylan, which I felt was a huge oversight because it doesn't explain the second half of the Beatles' career. But nevertheless, most of the time I like them and I recommend them. Now, Tom has written a great book about the effect of Christianity, the origins of Christianity, and the effect of Christianity down through the present day, particularly in Europe and the West. He is also a dedicated scholar of Roman history. Anything he's written about Rome, his recent book, Pax, I would recommend. I would tell you, if you want to know about Rome, read Tom Holland. As a place to begin. With all historians, it's always a place to begin because you never simply want to take the word of one historian. Next, as long as we're talking about the Roman era, the ancient times, the antique period, let's just say this. Go to the sources. So, go find Herodotus, his histories, Plutarch, Julius Caesar, And recently, Tom Holland himself has translated his own version of Suetonius's Lives of the Caesar, which would be a great place to start because it'll give you that early period as told by a Roman. Now, does this mean that these people knew more than we did? No, not necessarily. But what it does mean is they understood the thoughts of the people of their day much more than we do. So one of the problems we have is we'll see a movie like Gladiator or Ben-Hur, and we will think we know something about Rome. Well, you kind of do. You're getting a taste of it, but it's just a taste. And one of the things Tom Holland points out is that for a long time, he just liked Rome. And then he kept noticing this Christian thing over there, and then he started realizing, oh, the reason we are who we are today has less to do with Rome and more to do with these Christians. So, and that's a fair historian. That is to say, he had one view, he did reading, and then he adjusted his view. A good historian always has to be ready to adjust their views. I would also recommend medieval chronicles. I actually got into them because I did a bit of research on my genealogy, which suddenly slipped off into this period after the Roman Empire and before the High Middle Ages. And I was just fascinated. So there's the History of the Longobards by Paul the Deacon. Now, this is a medieval text looking at the history of what we usually call the Lombards, but they were also called the Longobards. They were actually a Swedish tribe who came down from Sweden. They called Longobards because they had long beards, get it? Anyway, they ended up in northern Italy. Fascinating stuff. And these books, there's another one I would recommend, The Chronicle of the Picts, which is more of a collective work. Also, The History of the Franks by Gregory, Bishop of Tours. All medieval works. And I highly recommend these because they give you the inside-out view of the Middle Ages. When you come and simply read something about the Middle Ages, I mean, when I read someone writing popularly and they'll say, you know, how filthy the Middle Ages was, how stupid the people were, I'm just going like, you know, we know where the stupidity lies. It's not in them. You know, it's in you for making these assumptions and obviously not getting a sense of the real world there. Don't overlook the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, as a history source. Now, a lot of people will say, well, we don't have collaborating evidence on everything. Fine. But what I would say this is, I tend to take it mostly as history with some things here or there pushed. Why? Because it's the way it's all written. It's written in such a way that nobody would just write this stuff down. Nobody in the first, 7, 8 chapters of the First Chronicles would simply write all those names down in order to simply prove a point. They did that. The Jews were scrupulous about history. Now, we could argue about when exactly these books were written and under what conditions. Fine. But what I'm saying is, if you really want to understand the ancient world, there isn't a text much more crucial than the Old Testament. And I highly recommend it. If you're a Christian and haven't spent much time with it, most Christians get to like Exodus, they get to Genesis, Exodus, Psalms, Job, maybe some Isaiah, or as the Brits say, Isaiah. I'm sure neither of us are saying it correctly. But I've read the Bible a couple times over, and I've read it in King James. I actually have a recording of the first third of the Old Testament being read in King James, which I've listened to, and I got really disappointed when I got to the end, and it was like, I don't have the rest of it. But there's something about it that smacks of truth. And I just simply say, you should read that, especially if you're a Christian or a Jew. Now, speaking of Christian history, I highly recommend the works of Kenneth Scott Latourette. Kenneth Scott Latourette, has written quite a bit of Christian history, and it's dense. And what I mean by dense is, if he writes a couple of lines about a figure, you can be sure those are a couple of deep lines. They're not like throwaway lines. And now he's got his large 2-volume Christian history of the Christian Church. He's also got a history of the expansion of Christianity in 7 volumes. So this isn't the history of the church, because he doesn't go into the doctrinal councils and, the heresies and all this. He goes into how Christianity expanded. 7 volumes. Also, and this is actually written to overlap with this series, is his Christianity in a Revolutionary Age, a history of Christianity during the 19th and 20th centuries. And that's 5 volumes. So there's 12 volumes in this massive set. I haven't read the whole thing, but what I do is I've gone over periods when I get really interested in a period. And what I've found is he's really good on every branch of Christianity. He doesn't just, although he is a Protestant, he doesn't just cover the Protestants, nor just his denomination. He covers the Catholics in depth, and he covers the Orthodox Church in depth as well. So I highly recommend him. And he was actually a specialist he was a sinologist, which means he studied China. And he was a specialist in the relationship between Christianity and China. Now, he died in the middle of the 20th century, but his work is still extremely valuable, and I've gotten a lot from it. More contemporary is Suzanne Lipscomb, and she's an English writer. She's also, you can find some of her presentations on the BBC, on YouTube. I particularly like her looking at things in the Tudor era or Victorian era or the early modern period that are in your house that will kill you. Those are kind of interesting. But her specialty is the Tudor period. And so if you're interested in all of the things related to Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, and all of that sort of thing, which is a fascinating era, she's your person. She's a good place, again, to start. Although I would say this, and I've said this before, you can start with Wikipedia. If you end there, you are an idiot. Now we come to one of my favorite historians. I mean, in a way, many of these are my favorite historians. But John Keegan, English military historian, fascinating histories of warfare and combat and battle and command. I highly recommend anything he's written. His perspective is always good. He is some sort of Christian, evidently, I guess in the Anglican Church, or was. He passed away a few years back. But I first discovered him in a book called The Face of Battle, where he discusses how battle has changed over the years. Also very important, his books on the First World War and the Second World War, respectively, both absolute gold. I can't recommend these books high enough. If you want a good book to start with on the Second World War or the First World War, these are excellent introductions. Also, he has a book simply called The History of Warfare, which is different than his The Face of Battle. The Face of Battle dealt with the subject simply of battle. That is to say, opposing sides in a field or not in a field, but fighting each other directly. Whereas warfare includes the whole picture. So it's the difference between tactics and strategy. So, Simon Schama. Now, Simon Schama is a very liberal guy. I don't agree with everything he says. I do follow him on X. He is often very pro-Israel. He's Jewish. He is also very much anti-Trump. That's fine. But here's the thing. I appreciate his history of Britain on that he did on television. He's got several good television series he's done. But I think his 2 best books are Citizens, which is a history of the French Revolution, which Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland reference quite a bit in their various histories of that period. And an even more interesting book, An Embarrassment of Riches, which is the history of the Dutch Golden Age. And if you are curious about Dutch art, Dutch democracy, and there was a golden age in the 17th century in the Netherlands, I highly recommend An Embarrassment of Riches. Now we come to Thomas Sowell. And he has a lot of books. A lot of them are more polemic, but I highly recommend for history, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, which gives you a good introduction to the settlement patterns of people, Scots-Irish people coming from Northern Ireland, but they're basically Scottish, and then coming to America and ending up in the Appalachians, and then how their culture, which was very rough and tumble, ended up becoming the culture of the urban black Americans by the 20th century. Fascinating subject. And he himself is black, as you probably know. But you need these. You see, you're trying to form a picture, and you need people who've done studies on this aspect or that aspect. I did an interview on my channel. You should look for it if you're interested in traveling or tourism, with Lucy Lethbridge, who's English, and she did a book called Tourist, which deals with the origins of popular tourism, which was a more bizarre affair than you probably imagine. I would go start by listening to our interview, and that's a good place to be in, but find that book. I believe it's only published in the UK right now, but you can buy it through the Big River store, if you know what I'm saying. James H. Johnson is someone I don't know a lot about, but I really appreciated his book called Venice Incognito. And it was a book about the use of masks in Venice, particularly from the 16th century to the end of the 18th century, when Napoleon came along and said, no more masks for you. And then eventually that was revived in the 1970s. Now, here's the deal. At this point, I could branch off and start talking about all my pet subjects related to masks and carnivals and clowns and circuses and puppets, but I'm not going to. Maybe I'll do that as a separate thing, and that would be for my Gravity from Above channel. But the point is this. You think you know something about carnival masks in Venice. Well, here's one thing I didn't know. Those masks were worn not during carnival time, but for like about half the year. What does that mean? Well, read that book. Fascinating book. Absolutely fascinating. Then we have Ernst Gombrich, who is an art historian that Rookmaaker really appreciated, and I started reading him. He has a book that's kind of an appreciation of art, a short history of art called The Story of Art, and it's written for like high school students. But it's a good, if you don't know much about art, that's a good place to start. But his specialty is in books on the Renaissance, and he's got about 10 of them. I've read about 6 of them, and lots of essays in those. Fascinating. He discusses the use of perspective, how it was discovered. He discusses, I did one video on this channel about a book of his where he discusses shadows in art and how they were developed. Fascinating man. Rookmaaker didn't always agree with him. And speaking of Rookmaaker, the next book is Modern Art and the Death of a Culture, which is a book I recommend. It's a little dated since Rookmaaker died in early 77, I believe. But for what he covers, it's fascinating. Now, someone came out with a book responding to him, some Christians, because they felt Rookmaaker was too negative. To which I'm sitting there saying, really? You think Rookmaaker was too negative? You should see what's developed since then. But there's always this side. There's one group who always says any act of creativity is valuable, and the other people who said, yeah, but this act led to this crisis. Rookmaaker is obviously in the first camp, because Rookmaaker was concerned with reality. His original history book was Synthesis Art Theories, and it's a study of the period of Paul Gauguin in French post-impressionism. And if you really want to get into that era, I highly recommend that book. Then there's David Thomson, who is a film historian who has written legions of books, which I highly recommend, all of them. I, again, don't agree with everything. Here's the point. If you're reading people and you agree with everything they say, you have problems. I don't agree with anything that, everything that everybody says. There's nobody I agree with 100%. From C.S. Lewis to Jacques Ellul to any of these writers. There's always something like, but that's okay. That's how we learn. Anyway, he wrote a book called The Big Screen, which was a history of the movie-going experience. The story of the movies, which is a history of Hollywood, essentially. The whole equation, which deals with how movies are made. A history of Hollywood, which was also the basis for a series, which I highly recommend watching. David Thomson, no P. And if you want to start somewhere, start with The Moment of Psycho. His argument that Psycho is the linchpin between the studio system, the older Hollywood, and the newer Hollywood, which comes after that. And I recommend that. Now we get to a couple of favorites, real favorites, who I appreciate so much of what they've done. One is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and his history books are The Gulag Archipelago, which is massive, 3 volumes, which really are 2 within each, so it's really 6, but 3 huge books. If you haven't got that kind of patience, or if your attention span has been so eroded by technology, I would recommend the 1-volume edition, which you just have to make sure you read the chapter called The Ascent. I find this one of the most important things. I read all 3 of these volumes. I even had to wait for the 3rd one. This is back in the 70s. They really changed my thinking about everything. His other books are The Oak and the Calf, which deals with his period after release from the gulags and until he basically had to leave Russia. He was kicked out. And it deals with this period. And he's got other memoirs. Anything he's done on a historical level is great. And his novels are great as well. And his short stories, and I could go on. Do I agree with everything he said? No. Why? Because he's human and I'm human. And finally, C.S. Lewis, and this could open a whole door to Charles Williams and Owen Barfield and all of this stuff, but we'll just stick with C.S. Lewis. And The Discarded Image, number 1, read that. If you don't read anything else by C.S. Lewis, read that for history content. Because he talks about the viewpoint of the Middle Ages and how essentially in the Middle Ages, they didn't look at the world as progressing. They looked back to Rome as kind of a golden age, but they saw themselves as more enveloped in the world. And, for instance, the idea of originality was a very strange thing to them. And they would often say, C.S. Lewis points out, and Owen Barfield does this as well, if, we say, I want to write this book that no one else has ever read. And they would say, are we reduced to telling our own stories now? Why not keep working with the old stuff and try to get new stuff out of it? Which I would say is a good antidote to where we are. To go back and start understanding the past and understanding history. But The Discarded Image, just the last chapter of that alone is enough to worth the read of the book. Studies in Words. This is C.S. Lewis's looking at words like, for instance, free, Or he's got one chapter called I Dare Say, the origin of this phrase. But he's looking at them historically and how words like nature, for instance, have changed over time. And one of the things we often forget is we are in a place that's constantly shifting and moving, and words change. And, in my series that I hope to finish before the end of the summer, let's be optimistic, called The Cute and the Creepy, one of the things I want to point out is, one, the word cute didn't exist hardly 100 years ago, and two, creepy is developing right now into something very odd. Also, if you really want to go overboard, his English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, that's the full title, that's C.S. Lewis as part of an Oxford series on the literature of England. So those are just something to get you started. Like I say, I'm not with all of my books. I've got other history books here. There are so many more. And sometimes I find history in unlikely places. I've spent quite a while thinking about history so that when I go to a movie, I'm often saying, no, nobody dressed like that then. And I'll be looking and I'll go, that was really good. That got close. I felt, like one of my favorite films is Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, which I could point out some things in it that I'm going, is that medieval? But in fact, the film feels like taking you and dropping you, current you, into the Middle Ages and then saying, we'll see you later. Because, the conversations and the way the whole thing is just fantastically medieval. And a great movie will do that and inspire you to go further into it. And of course, going to original sources is an important thing as well. So one thing I've done a lot of study on is blackface minstrel music in America. Well, what are the original sources? Well, I'll give you a hint. One of the original sources are all the recordings we can find from as old as possible, or people who've reconstructed what the music sounded like in the 19th century, or looking at the posters for the shows, or the sheet music and the illustrations on the front, of realizing that suddenly, this old, weird, strange music ends up turning into country music and jazz and all this other stuff. And it's the white side of the equation. Anyway, I say, learn some history. No matter who you are, you need to learn some history. Even if it's, let's say you're someone who likes to knit. What do you know about the history of knitting and wool? Let's say you're someone who enjoys sports of some sort. What do you know about the history of that sport? And so I would just like to encourage you to learn, and to learn your own history. I will be doing an update at some point in the future on my own genealogical research. Because like I pointed out at the beginning, I discovered some really crazy stuff, which made me get these medieval books and going, I'm in there. No, I'm not, and that's the thing. I'm not like those people at all. It's more like, it's homeopathic almost. It's like a fractal of the past is within all of us. But it's all there. The past is still present. It hasn't passed away. It's much more solid than the present, which is slipping away as we talk. And the future, well, can anyone predict right now what the world will be like in a year? No. That's how crazy things are. So, we are not in a period of calm. We are in an almost farcically strange times where people seem to be guided by, the little device in their hands, the little shining light. And with AI coming on the scene, the more you know, the better. AI is not your friend. AI is not going to teach you history. They say students are cheating now more than ever because of AI. They just go to AI and say, tell me about this and that, and AI will pump out all this information. Truthfully, unless you work for the information yourself, which is how I know so much, because I evidently have, I don't claim to be a historian, except when we come to certain subjects in music. Then I will put my knowledge against pretty much anyone, which is how I can say, Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook forgetting Dylan was a major oversight. Sorry, Tom. Anyway, thanks for watching. And remember, you can support the channel. And if you've gotten this far and you want to leave a comment, let's use a special phrase. Let's say, discarded image. Use that in a sentence somehow. From Tbilisi, Georgia, Nachwamdis and Droibit. We will meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
History does seem to me of necessity as there's something incredibly impoverished and narrow and myopic and dangerous about living inside the contemporary, it seems to me, actually. To live one's life entirely within the contemporary seems an act of sort of dangerous intolerance, in a way, of the experience of the past whose heirs we self-evidently are. So, in some sense, Cicero was correct, I believe, when he said that to have no knowledge or understanding, or to no wish to understand the past, restricts one to the mental life of a small child, really small child, an infant, actually, who has no understanding or needs no understanding of where we've come from, and therefore has no understanding of whither we go. And so I think history is an act of redress, that's the word I was looking for, redress, against the perilous narrowness of living with contemporary. And it instructs one, actually, it obliges one to make the effort to really encounter and encompass and live with previous experience. In that sense, it's always an issue of reaching towards others' experience of other cultures, experience of other times, of other places.